Welcome to Panels, a series of conversations hosted by Modem about our complex relationship with technology. My name is Emily Segal, moderator of the series. Today, we explore the topic of design, branding, and creative practice in the age of machine intelligence. A few questions. How is machine intelligence transforming design systems and creative practices? And what new forms of creativity might emerge as a result? By contrast, what are the pitfalls? We will address the question from the branding angle: designers, systems, conventions, collaborations, and business all coming together, or not. And a final question: how has the notion of finality, permanence, or even the deliverable itself evolved from a static item into an evolving system? Today, I'm joined by Michael Rock, founding partner and executive creative director of legendary design studio 2x4 in New York, lecturer at the Yale School of Management, and design critic at the New York Times. Samir Bantal is director of AMO, the research and design studio of OMA, Office for Metropolitan Architecture. And welcome, Michael and Samir.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily, for having us.
My pleasure. So today I wanted to sort of kick us off with the theme of permanence or impermanence. So as we live in this landscape where our technologies and our design tools become ever more powerful and allow us to have ever more access to a sort of editable state of things, for lack of a better word, I'm curious how both of you think about what it means to kind of run a designer architecture process or have something go from beginning, middle to end in a time when those very notions are being questioned by technology itself.
Samir, do you want to start?
I was just going to ask you. Well, I think there's a couple of interesting notions, like with the increasingly importance of machine learning or AI in our field that has clearly entered our field and probably is also here to stay. I see this kind of interesting, almost like paradox, where you have you actually are forced to think of a finalized design before you have even started. So meaning that, like with the power and with the tools that we have with AI, instead of going through a process of options, ideas, and very basic nostalgic black hand sketches on white paper, you immediately get this kind of finalized, hyper-realistic image of the end result before you've even started the design process, which is interesting because like the machine tool would be able to actually provide you much more, almost like an infinite amount of possibilities or future situations. Instead, we become more and more fixated on the end result at the very beginning. So I was just like browsing through some old, like, nostalgic OMA books, like, presentation books, where I'm like, I open a spread and literally the only thing that I see is like, two perspectives, like this big, like 3 inches wide, of a perspective drawn with hand. Like it's impossible now to imagine that you would present that to a client. They want finishes, they want the material, they want reflection to be right, they want everything in the beginning. So paradoxically, the tool that we have to create this kind of infinite possibilities and options, we are actually very much trained to go to an end result at the very beginning before we've even started.
I think that what's interesting about that, Samir, is you're still kind of focused on this idea of results. And, because ultimately, I assume the thing takes physical form in the world somewhere, which is a permanent statement or a statement of finality somehow. And I think that, coming at it from the side that we're thinking about it, those it basically overturns the basic assumption of, a brand or something, where you're presenting a big idea to a lot of people and they're getting the same message, more or less. You're trying to control the message for a lot of people. But I think that, now what we're really imagining is that every person gets their own message, right? So it breaks down that there isn't a kind of single deliverable that sort of is passed out into the world, but each deliverable, it could be customized for each person who gets it, right? And that's kind of the maddening, kind of degraded part of social media now, right? Which is that you see this thing which is so customized for you, you start to, it starts to become annoying, I think, like, why do I have to have this ad, which is exactly based on so obviously what my shopping trend is or something like that. And so I think that you have this idea of customization, which really just obliterates the idea of a permanence or of a singularity. It becomes like this customization so specific to a group or to an individual that you're almost designing like kind of infinite number of pieces. So those infinite number of examples that you can imagine the machine could produce actually becomes the product in itself, which could be distributed to, people everywhere.
Yeah.
Emily, what do you think about that?
Strangely, when it, excuse me, strangely, what it makes me think about is the rise of, especially in the last year, these sort of mega celebrity moments, like the Taylor Swift moment or the Beyonce moment, as the counterpoint to sort of endless customization, where perhaps what's happening on your screen or your devices are these sort of perhaps kind of busted, but nonetheless semi-personalized, endlessly iterative messages. And then, as a counterpoint to that, or in a dialectical relationship with that, there's this obsession with these icons that are sort of for everyone in the form of these goddess-like celebrities. And I wonder if that's where the 20th century brand identity is being carried out. So instead of it just being this, now old-fashioned concept of like the logo and the message that connects to some deeper archetypal sense that resonates with everyone. Now we're getting that kind of through celebrities, and design is becoming this fragmented on screen thing by contrast.
Yeah, I think the word obsession is also interesting because the amount of production, the amount of options, the amount of possibilities or possible futures, almost as you could say it, is an obsession with a with an unreachable precision. Like we're aiming to be extremely precise, but we know that we will actually, as if it's as if we're sucked into a black hole, with a kind of an infinite amount of time that you would spend being sucked in. Like you will never reach that moment. So it's interesting how we're, opening this tool as if we're doing ourselves a favor, where I'm actually questioning, like, how much of a favor is this? And how much does this help either, let's say, the designer or even the client? Because the client suddenly has access to an infinite amount of possibilities and options. Therefore, it becomes even harder to make any decision, any design decision.
Last time we spoke, Michael, you brought up this McLuhan quote about how sort of outmoded technologies return as art. And I wonder, Samir, hearing about looking at those older pitch decks and seeing the more primitive drawings, I wonder if there could, if those were to be brought back, if it would have an almost like fetishistic quality. Like if there's something about the way that everything has become so high gloss and customized that would paradoxically confer some new value on those older types of drawings. Do you think that would be possible in a client relationship now?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in just for a second because I think that McLuhan says things don't become obsolete, they move toward obsolescence, and as that move toward obsolescence basically gives them new value. And I was thinking since then, a comparison is GMO modified feed for cattle. Like basically every dairy product that you consume probably has that involved in it. But then there's become a whole market for non-GMO things, right? And that they're actually more expensive to have it without that, even though that's the huge majority is not non-GMO. And I can imagine, not even in a very far distant, that things will be labeled, non-AI produced design or something like that, like made by humans or something, will be a value, even though like vast majority will be made by machines. The things that aren't will have a new value, will kind of revalued in a different way. They'll come back as something special, and you can go to like your local shop to get like the real stuff versus the things that are produced on the daily basis. So we have to
Are,
design
are
a non-AI violator to put on products, so it's like,
artisanal architecture and artisanal branding will
right,
return, is the prediction.
right.
Samir, what do you think?
Um, I haven't like really figured out yet like what the position is there, because I do see a very, you know, interesting idea that, like with the kind of repetitive actions that you would typically have within your design process, that actually only would cost a lot of time, you suddenly have a machine that actually does it much faster, much more accurate. Meaning, theoretically, you would end up actually having more time to spend on the actual design or the actual thinking of the project. Um, but then maybe like I go back to what we also discussed last time, that more than like options or possibilities, I think the meaning of language becomes more important. Since we like whenever we use an AI, we think of a prompt, right? So, and the more precise you are with your prompt, or the more original you are with your prompt, the better the outcome would be, theoretically, right? So, whereas if you rely much more on hard data, then it's the more data, the more precise. But so then we're getting to a point like, is it about precision, or is it about, let's say, imagination, or is something actually much more intangible than precision? Because the more input we give it, the more precise answer we get. But maybe the essence of a design process is actually to not know what the outcome is, because to not know what the outcome is actually what makes your product, your design, or what is it, more interesting. So I'm a bit torn about between kind of like, using it as a form of creating more time to do, let's say, the essential part of what the creative process is, or um, or does it actually, endanger that free time that you would be able to spend.
But I was wondering, Samir, when I was thinking about that, like the role of the red Bic pen at OMA. At OMA, basically, there's a red Bic pen somehow indicates authenticity, right? That it's been touched somehow, it's human, it's this very physical thing. And does it still have that kind of quality where, if something is drawn in red Bic pen, that it has a kind of special quality which is separate from the rest of the design process? Is there an origin point?
Well, I mean, um, less personal, but I think it does show that sometimes like you don't need a kind of heavy machinery almost like to make a design decision. Like a
Right.
design decision often is really kind of like deeply embedded in your gut feeling almost.
Yeah.
And that gut feeling is not something that you can reproduce or make faster using a kind of machine. In that sense, I don't want it to give it a too big of an importance, but it's definitely it it's a personification of making decisions, and reviewing outcomes. And then maybe to go back to the idea of like, the language, I think since this office, of course, like has a an approach that is much more embedded in language because the person who founded the office started as a writer, and writing is actually an incredibly important component of the production. It's less about the aesthetics or the polished end result. It's much more about, well, I mean, maybe narrative is not the right word, but language in itself and communication, actually.
Though I think it's kind of interesting that if you think about like again, McLuhan's four media laws, the first one is, what does this new media enhance? And it seems like, when you talk about large language models, what it enhances is that it's giving you narrative, it's giving you text, right? Rather than just search results somehow. So thinking about your practice based on writing, that's exactly what AI in a way, or like at least a large language model version of AI would be like producing writing, right? And that would be seen as an enhancement of the old search term or the way of looking for something, right? Like it generates text. So you could imagine, that your practice, that AI could get quite good at presenting, OMA style text that would be a progenitor of a project somehow, without having to go and necessarily have all the problems of the person who actually writes it or something.
Which is actually a very interesting idea that as a designer you would want your machine model to actually produce text and written results rather than an image. So it's no mid-journey. It's just like an enhanced form of Chat GPT, maybe. I don't know. And then for you as a designer to then make an interpretation of that, and that becomes your design.
Right. Well, I know Emily published a book recently where, the author wrote in parallel with an AI. So you have this kind of uncanny relationship between, is it human, is it AI, and when can you really tell the difference and when can't you tell the difference, right? So, that you could actually the human in it could become, hard to discern at a certain point.
Well, what I think was so interesting about that book, which is called A More Cringe by an author named Kay Alato McDowell, which my press Deluge Books put out, is that the author intentionally blurred their own experience in the composition of the book between stuff that they would write themselves and stuff that would come out of the machine and sort of let it blend together and blur together. And then when you open the book, that situation is framed for you. So as the reader, you know that there's no answer. There's no like typographic differentiate. It's not like the human stuff is bold and the AI stuff is italic. And what I've found is that it helped me reflect on the weird ways that there's a different sort of friction or frictionlessness when you're consuming media that is AI generated. Like sometimes it can be much harder to pay attention to it, but then just the suggestion that human cognition was behind it somehow changes the quality of our attention. I wonder if this might be part of this strange transitional amphibious moment that we're in, where we're kind of adjusting at the moment, and maybe that will totally change, or it might speak to a deeper clue about what causes us to really pay attention or causes us to have a deeper awareness, which paradoxically, or perhaps not paradoxically, that's the wrong word, but just those are both that's relevant to both like the experience of architecture or the experience of a brand. The idea is that you're in this a very special building. It has a special quality of attention. If you're in this space, you can feel it. Or if you're encountering something extremely iconic, an iconic combination of visuals and words, like it reaches you in some sort of special way. I guess this is where we get into the more like mystical or occult parts of both of these practices. But they're also kind of truisms to how we explain to ourselves and to students and to clients like that's what we're after. So there is this question of like, will the special sauce in terms of this like magical occult moment where everything sings. I mean, Michael's written quite a lot about coherence and what it means. Coherence is one part of it. Incoherence is another important part of it. is that is that very quality at risk right now?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to separate the fact that, you know, a huge 98% of the words you read every day are banal at best, right? Or mediocre, and who cares really who wrote them? Like, do you really care who wrote that, legal notice that you have to click through to get to the website you want to go to, or, the banking brochure, like it's pretty bad in general. So it probably would only be improvement if a machine wrote it or something like that. So we're really talking about a very narrow sliver of the stuff that where it matters somehow, and so I'm not really like that concerned when I get my bank statement if an AI wrote the welcome letter to it or not, because I probably didn't even read it in the first place, So I think there's a huge amount of stuff that's just going to be like generated like that, and the letter might be generated and styled differently for different people, and it'll have like these different qualities, but it's so insignificant in your life. But when you're talking about a kind of level of artfulness, and the things that are really artful, where you really feel that in the world, are so rare and special. I think that in a way, the working in parallel with the AI makes those moments even more special, right? They became even more branded as being human or human generated or partially human generated, which is where I think that the OMA, branding of the authentic with the red ink is a way to sort of say like, oh, so a human touched this. There's an indexical sign of someone made this thing, right? And that the idea was generated by, not by a machine, by someone else. And so I think that those moments where you have like, okay, this is a building that was made, not purely by analyzing a set of data points and generating something that came out of that, but with a real sense of human inspiration and quality and humanity behind it, I think it'll make those things more special, and therefore they'll, become more expensive, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting idea because like your question, Emily, was like what's at risk, and I think maybe um, the risk is that we are now too focused on like what the machine can or cannot do and the role of the machine, while maybe at the same time we're going to be exploring much more what the human can do, and therefore almost like embarking on a renaissance of like art, literature, and whatever, like from a human perspective. So I think that actually could be a very exciting idea rather than almost outsourcing humanism to a machine. We almost like retake it and reinvent it and own it.
Yeah, I think like an example of that is the work of Nick Benson in Newport, Rhode Island, and Nick's father was one of the great stone carvers of letter forms in the world, and they own a shop which has been there since like the 18th century or something like that, and his daughter now is becoming a stone carver. And obviously stone carving by hand is an extremely non-AI kind of activity, but it's hyper infused with aura now because we know that the banal majority of stuff like that can be easily made by a machine, right? So we kind of invest in it all these other qualities. But I think also and again, talking purely as a designer, as a creative director and a graphic designer, this process, we've already been so deeply entangled with the software that we have to work with now that it's not such a big leap into this other thing, which is that there was a certain point, I think, in the work that we do where the design was the stuff that was done with the red pen, and then it was turned over to some people who made the stuff, and so that there was a really clear division between the thinking part of the design and the conceptual part of it, and the people who kind of crafted it and made the stuff that had to be reproduced. But now, at the point when, Quark Express or these other tools came in, where the designer was making the design on the exact same tool that would actually produce the design, that, in a way, I guess it's probably similar to Revit or something like that, where the designers are producing basically the drawings that will be actually made by the people who actually build the thing. So we're already working so deeply in the the laws that the machine tells us to work with, that we have to go and do it a certain way. Otherwise, it's too hard for the machine to figure it out or something like that. So I feel like we've already been slaves to the machine for a long time. So I'm not sure it's going to be like such a big transformation, but then maybe the stone carving and those moments of real humanity and real craft and things like that become hyper valued in a different way or something.
I think that speed and volume of what these tools produce is the big difference at the moment, because I've thought of this a lot with critics of AI generated writing, which obviously I have a sort of sympathetic view toward, or else I wouldn't have published this book that's half AI generated, which is not to say that I want all literary fiction to be AI generated, just that I think it has a long history from, going back to Dada and the Surrealists, or any sort of art practices that tried to bring kind of the unknown or break what was possible or use tools in this sort of ready-made way. I think that there's a sort of artistic lineage that you could look at AI generated writing with. And when people are really critical of it, you have to think, well, are you this critical of word processing? Do you need all of your novels to be written with a quill? Like, there's an enormous amount of automated labor that goes into the composition of writing as it stands that we totally ignore. And if you think about not that far in the past, it was much, much more difficult to compose and edit a long text. And that obviously changes the quality of the text. But there's a whole category of automation that we take for granted and ignore. And then there's a whole type of automation that, because it's newer and because it has this sort of scary energy around it, for lack of a better word, people tend to freak out about. But the real difference in terms of what gets produced is that, of course, you could, copy and paste a million times with Quark in a way that you couldn't with the tools that you were using before. But now, if you're using generative AI, you can produce, thousands of options that are different so quickly. And that does seem to have a very different effect on the creative and design
Yeah,
process.
I mean, I think that the word processing versus Quill is really different. That's much more in the enhancement version of McLuhan than what AI is to word processing, because I think that, the word, my Microsoft Word has never written a letter for me, right? It's helped me do it, and it makes it easier, and a spell check and things like that, but it doesn't generate the content, or and the AI can, and that's where I think then you have the possibility of breaking down the whole idea of the mass of mass media, and again, the one of the McLuhan's laws is this idea of what does it retrieve from the past. It retrieves basically something which is personalization, I guess, in the sense like, I don't have to go and talk to everyone in through this mass media where, every Nike thing has an orange border around it, but it's basically, they're at least the feeling of a relationship between the thing that you're getting and the thing that produced it, right? Even though the relationship is purely and algorithm based. So that aspect of creating a series of relationships rather than a series of tools which speak to everyone in a very broad way seems like that's really different than the tools that we've had in the past somehow.
I want to go back to something that Samir was bringing up before, which was the significance of the prompt and language as the genesis of the design process. Because I do think there's an interesting sort of diptych here, where on one hand, we have the sort of incredible rise of the significance of the mood board over the last 10 or 15 years. And in that case, design processes were very much led by copying or aping certain images that existed. And something that I found very funny slash frightening in my own experiences with clients is that there was this period where there are certain clients who can kind of get the gist from a mood board, like, the real, what it's intended to express, the mood of it. And then there started to be certain clients where if you showed them a green box but said, imagine this green box, but it's blue, they couldn't imagine it blue unless you actually made a digital image that was the blue version. And so things started to get much more granular, and it became much more about copying the exact image. So you're feeding images into a design process and then getting something out on the other side. And then it actually seems quite different to me if what you were doing in the case of the prompt is sort of like feeding the the brief into the machine and skipping over the design process in a way, or skipping over the design process as we've traditionally known it, where there might be a brief, then that brief gets interpreted, turned into images, those images are iterated upon. I'm going more quickly than every single bit of the design process, of course. And then you get some results that you can mark up with a red pen, discuss with people, get feedback from the client, continue to iterate on until you get a final process. One starts with a group of images or a group of modified images, and one starts with words. And I wonder if we'll see these two paradigms merge, or we're really moving out of the mood board era into the prompt era. I'm curious just to hear a few more reflections from both of you on that.
Yeah, that's I, I'm I'm trying to figure out like also like the mood board, the importance of the mood board because that's something that we've always really tried to stay away from because if you're starting to present examples, I think you're basically doing what a machine tool is doing, which is reprocessing existing examples. While I think the most interesting projects and interesting proposals come actually by either chance, coincidence, or something completely unplanned, right? So if we simply take the example of the Porto project, like the theater, the music hall, um, that idea actually was originally a house for a private client, and the project was pulled from the client because at some moment there wasn't a kind of understanding, like the chemistry wasn't there for the project to proceed to become an actual building. And by chance, in that same week, a competition was launched for this music hall in Portugal. The office decided to take that existing design, blow it up to a different size and a different um, dimension, and voila, you have basically a design that gets built and won the competition, etc. Would you have gotten the same result if you would ask the AI to think of a music hall? Most likely not, because it would scrape the internet of every music hall designed ever and just makes a very nice version of a kind of amalgamation of music halls, but it would never be the one that actually surprises anyone. And I think that's also like, the power of design, maybe, and the power of architecture or however you want to do, like in terms of creativeness, is there is a power of surprise. And the funny thing is like with a lot of the results that I see coming out of a image-based model, is it always seems familiar, like even to that the blue foam model or the blue foam production becomes like an aesthetic that people really like. So I'm still questioning like whether it would ever reach the same level for which we want the machine to actually generate our ideas, or whether it would, get to a high point where like, okay, we're super excited about this, but actually, like maybe just like use it for the most redundant or kind of like, repetitive work.
Right, but in theory, you could prompt an AI to design a music hall that looks like a massive public toilet. And that would be unusual. It's like you could feed in a weird prompt, is what of course, if you're just asking for like the most generic music hall or the nicest, most generic music hall, of course, what you're going to get is not going to be this breakthrough thing. But there's also a certain amount of absurdity that you can sort of like generate at a high resolution that also would also take a huge amount of work to do without the tool. So that's the other piece of it. Not to
Yeah,
say that those results are actually as transcendent as what would come out of a different process, but it is possible based on how weird the prompt is.
But I think
I question
that
that. Go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think that there you're trying to go and trick the AI to be creative, right? Like by engineering your prompt in a certain way, like the public toilet, so that, that seems crazy what we do. I think there's the other aspect, which is the hallucination. And I think the hallucination is more like the design process. Because the hallucination, no one can quite describe why a language model hallucinates the way they do. But that then the possibility of doing something truly strange and a bit transgressive is there, I think. And because we don't exactly know what the process is, and that feels more like inductive reasoning than deductive reasoning, that you prepare yourself with a lot of things and suddenly you make this leap. And the leap from the private house to Porto is one that's very hard to describe why that happened, and so we think about that designer moment when you just have this like, fuck it, we just did it. And then, but I think that there's a possibility that models do that too, right? That they have this, and that can be really jarring and freeing. You're like, oh, I never thought about it that way somehow, and so, I think that aspect of the jump, the creative jump, is something that we hold on to as designers, thinking like that's really what we bring to it. We have this moment of, um, of special insight that happens. We can't really describe why it happens, but that's what makes the design special to us. But maybe machines can do that too. But I think of also, I think of something that Rem wrote. I go back to this a lot, which is, functionality is boring, performance is what role the building plays, and what stance it takes, or something like that. Or what ideas it triggers, or something like that. And I think thinking about like a design as a trigger, as something like it's not really about just getting all the data points and making something that fulfills its functional things. It triggers something in the user, right? And you don't always know what how it triggers, or what ultimately the result of that would be, but that it has this kind of magical quality, which is very hard for us to define even as designers, but somehow it sparks something in not only in the way that we made it, but also in the person who uses it, right? That they can't quite put their finger on it either. And that so I think about that idea of what kind of scene it triggers as a role for design a lot, which is not, it's not really about functioning, it's about this moment of realization or something.
Yeah, but in a way, still, I feel that the idea of like, as you said, like, tricking the machine into hallucinating like an original idea is still based on a lot of input of examples of things that the machine has seen before, and trying to, like maybe recreate a new idea of it. While I think the process that actually is in our brain can, let's say, identify something that maybe feels original more than the way that the machine is actually trained to be incredibly, well, hyper specifically average. Because it's basically an average image of an infinite amount of points. Um,
Except
Therefore,
that, except that I think that, we're getting to the point where, right now it's training on a whole bunch of things that humans made, but increasingly it'll train on a whole bunch of things that other AIs made, right? So it starts to become a new system, which we don't really have that much control over. And so, right now, if the system is basically taking all the design that's ever been produced and feeding it into its database somehow. But now as AI produces more and more of the stuff in the world, that'll be the stuff that's fed into the system, right? So it becomes detached from the human in a certain way, and maybe then that creates the possibility for a kind of creativity which is a non-human creativity. It's based on, it's so many generations removed from something that a human ever made in the first place that it ultimately has the possibility of surprise. But it surprises humans because it's like something that a human would never have thought of or something. And I think that's where designers could have this really interesting parallel relationship to this thing, which is thinking up of its own ideas, or coming up with, generating things that we wouldn't have generated ourselves somehow.
Right. It becomes a dialogue in theory,
Right.
or could
Yeah.
be. And because what keeps coming up are these questions of control. Like, are we creating this sort of unmanageable AI god who will either control us if we don't control it? Like, we need to kneecap it so that it doesn't make us its slave. Or are we being tricked, or are we tricking each other? Like, all of these questions of sort of like control and power are the metaphors that often are the ones most readily reached for in this discourse. And I think what's
Or are
interesting,
we,
oh no, go ahead.
or are we becoming hyperhuman in that sense?
Tell me more. What's hyperhuman?
Well, I mean, like, if we have a machine that actually is incredibly capable of mimicking human thought, like where does that place us? Like, are we becoming like more human in that sense? Or, is there like I have no idea. Like, I don't understand like how that would relate to each other. But um what I'm just trying to refer to the point that I made earlier, like, it could lead to a kind of like new renaissance of what humanism or humanity or being human means.
Right, because humans will provide like the most delectable wabi sabi, whereas like machine wabi sabi will always be sort of secondary. That I mean, I think that's sort of the artisanal idea that it's like this sublime, or when I'm imagining this, I don't know the stone carvings that you're referring to, Michael, but when I'm imagining it, it's like it's some incredible mix of like an of extraordinary technical polish and like the idiosyncratic here and there deviation that makes it so special or something like that. That's what really does it for us. And if you talk about being hyperhuman, it's like it's our imperfections and our limitations that make us
Yeah.
human in addition to our ability to, be inspired and channel all these different inputs and do these technical things. But there's always a limit
But
to it.
I mean, I actually really like this theory that Samir just has generated because, this idea of hyperhumanity, it's kind of as as the world's taken over by other tools that can do it better than we can, we resort to the things that make us special, right? That we really work on the things that the machine can't do, and it forces us to focus on those things, right? Like not get lost in the details of writing the banking letter or the legal disclaimer, but really like what can I do that only I can do that a machine can't do, and to really try to reclaim that, and that maybe is a kind of opening for designers again to rethink basically the thing that we can do is this special and let the machine do all the stuff we don't want to do anyways.
Something that's coming to mind also is has to do with sort of the advice that a lot of creative people are given starting out, whether they're writers or designers or architects, which has to do with sort of finding some sort of sublime meaning or purpose and doing a lot of repetitive tasks. Like if you want to be a writer, the cliche is you have to write every day. And there are lots of different ways of looking at that, but that, you write and write and write and write. Or if you're doing design, or I know less about the exact advice given to some young architects, but you iterate, 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 make a million different versions, try it again, try it again, try it again. And of course, on some level, I think because I've engaged in those practices myself to some degree, I do understand that there's this idea that certain sublime things happen through repetition. You feel like there's no way you'll be able to come up with something new, but then by doing it over and over and over again, certain things that were hard become easier, and then there are these moments of surprise that break through, and then you learn something new. But of course, there's also something about that advice that has to do with the fact that there's something about the process that needs you to rotely repeat these actions over and over again. And what happens when that's not strictly necessary? Does that type of practice become a sort of religious rite where we're saying like, no, there's something magical and sublime and more than the sum of its parts that will happen if you do that? Or will the advice about how to become good at your craft or your trade totally change?
I would imagine Samira, for the stagiaire at OMA, that they had to believe that this kind of kind of mindless repetition was a value in itself and that they were getting something from doing it. Because otherwise, how do you get people to do that? How do you get people to make like 150 models of something if they don't believe that there's sort of some end goal in that, and also they don't believe that there's a machine that could do it faster and better than them, and they could go out and have beer or whatever.
Yeah.
So so
Well,
that yeah, does that become a kind of Zen practice or something like that?
Well,
That
first of all, unfortunately,
level, but it doesn't really have a functional level anymore or something.
yeah, unfortunately, like the long tables full of models don't exist anymore because again, like we also see that like the generations today, they feel much more comfortable in doing that in a very quick digital way, which I find quite sad. But I think that's also like a jump we're making. But um, I actually wanted to like refer to something more different, like the idea that through repetition you become a master. I think is something that we actually also try to unprove in a way. Um, I think the one thing that we often try to do is start out as a total amateur, as someone who doesn't know anything about any subject, um, because that starting point actually enables you to be more investigative and look for you know maybe a different answer than what you would get to if you repeat it often, right? So examples of like the research on the countryside was because we actually didn't know anything about the countryside. um, and so we thought we would be the perfect writers of an exhibition on the countryside because we know nothing about the countryside, and that I think is a really fundamental uh, difference from the path of doing something as an expert, because as an expert you might tend to lose yourself in a repetition that you believe has value, while I think in some cases that has less value. Yes, we design buildings, but we don't do 500 libraries because we've done an amazing library. Like we actually try to avoid that.
So is that kind of amateurism one of those hyperhuman
Yeah,
qualities?
I
Like,
think amateurism is hyperhuman.
right, that our own the one thing machines can't replace is our own ignorance or something like that.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
How do
I
you
love
how do you design, or how do you start from not knowing? And
Right.
that's actually like a point from the AI that it can't, because it can't not know anything because it knows everything.
or so we think.
So we think,
I think that this is a perfect place for us to wrap up.
right?
We forecasted the rise of the hyperhuman age, which I think is absolutely historic. And I want to thank both of you for joining us and for your contributions. And it's been a wonderful conversation today. So thanks a lot.
Wonderful
Thank
to be
you,
here. Thank you, Emily.
thank you, Michael.